With me today is Robert Cummins, a preeminent and world-renowned well-being researcher. Bob, can you tell us your current title and institutional affiliation?
Yes, I'm Professor of Psychology at Deakin University in Melbourne.
Very good. Can you tell me where you grew up?
First of all, in England until I was about 2 years old, and then in India for the next 3 years. My mother and I went out to join him. He'd been posted there during the war as a general practitioner. And then we went back to England, up to Scotland, where he got his postgraduate fellowship in surgery, and then really a number of different places around England, but we ended up in a little village outside Cambridge called Papworth Everard, which was at that stage a thoracic hospital primarily, but has now turned into, I think, England's major centre for thoracic surgery.
I see. What were your hobbies and interests as a child?
Being extremely naughty, getting into every kind of mischief possible, failing badly at school. I was truly a terrible child.
And so you were quite a miscreant. Was there any? Did you have any particular interest besides raising hell as a child?
I used to like collecting things, so it didn't really matter what it was. It might be birds' eggs or stamps. But I had this very eclectic collection of things, and it's interesting how that has transformed itself in my adult life into a collection of data, publications, particularly instruments to measure subjective well-being, and so I have this vast collection of these things, much to the pleasure of my students, who can circumvent their own search strategies largely by asking me for a copy of what it is that they want. So it's funny how it's made that transition.
You're still the collector then?
Still a collector, very much so.
What were your parents' attitudes about education?
They were very strong, but they were sort of resigned to the fact that I was going to be a very failing child. So they were actually quite decent about the whole thing. And we migrated to Australia when I was 12 going on 13. And I assimilated in Australia extraordinarily quickly by getting in with a group of very naughty boys here, and scraped through high school for the first year or so. They then sent me to boarding school, and that was a very good thing because the boarding school was in the north of Queensland, an extremely no-nonsense kind of an establishment. And they just assumed that all of the boys would knuckle down literally under canes and almost whips to make sure that they studied diligently and passed their examinations. And so through that experience, I learnt, I suppose, to be careful in my naughtiness, but also they got me through with a sufficient grade to get through into university.
And what turns your life around such that you might pursue the life of the mind in some way?
I always knew that I wanted to be an academic. Ever since I really got into university, I wanted to be that thing. So it's kind of interesting that I've never wanted to do anything else. And I've had really 3 phases of my academic career. Initially, it was my PhD was on neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, rats' brains, there was an interesting idea at that time called the enrichment isolation paradigm.
The Rosenvig work and
Exactly so. That's right. So he was our hero, Mark Rosenvig, and I worked with other students and colleagues in that area probably for 5 or 6 years, doing my master's and doing my PhD, first of all at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, and then at the University of Western Australia in Perth. And this was a very fruitful area. The idea was that environmental enrichment caused parts of the brain, particularly parts of the hippocampus, to show increased development. But as I went on with my studies, I started looking at wild rats and determined that their hippocampuses were absolutely enormous compared with the laboratory ones. And this rapidly led me into a little set of studies, which was the basis of my PhD, in which I showed that it wasn't enrichment that was causing the brain to grow bigger. It was the isolation condition that was causing brains to grow smaller.
Interesting.
And suddenly this area was of no interest at all. I mean, showing that brains don't develop properly when you limit the sensory experience is hardly interesting.
I see.
And so we published that and numerous papers during that time, including in Science and Nature and the Psychological Review. And then I had to scamper away really from that area because I really had dealt it a bit of a death blow in terms of showing what was actually going on. And that coincided then with me having to move from the university anyway, because my tenure was up and I was looking for another job. And at that stage I had a young family just starting, and so I was looking for somewhere with tenure, and I didn't really care what I was doing in there. And so I became employed in Melbourne, in a college in Melbourne, which was a big shock for me because in Australia, and particularly in Perth, the University of Western Australia is big cheese. It's a very well-renowned institution, and I moved from that to this little college in Melbourne and had a bit of an identity crisis, I remember. So I became very involved with the Australian Psychological Society, and that gave me the sense of identity that I was looking for. But I also joined a faculty of special education, and so my work in the neurology area gave me some interesting background in which to understand disability, but really my whole research effort changed enormously, and over the next probably decade or so I became very involved with particularly intellectual disability. And then towards the end of that period somebody came into my room one day and said, there are some colleagues of mine at Melbourne University working on a grant for quality of life. Would you be interested? I've always had this problem of saying yes. I just automatically agree to anything that looks even vaguely interesting. So I remember saying yes and then thinking to myself, I have no idea what that is. I wonder. And it turned out that the two people I was joining were at that time and historically a couple of the most interesting researchers in subjective wellbeing. Both at Melbourne University, Alex Wearing and Bruce Heddy.
Yes, very.
And so I didn't know.
Titans of the field, yeah.
They were absolutely amazing. They were leading the field, really.
Yes, yes.
In showing that subjective well-being changed but then came back to some previous value after an event had happened. And so they really were the first to show serious stability in subjective wellbeing. And so we applied for a little grant and got it, and so I worked with them and then got totally sucked into this amazing area of quality of life, and I knew then that I was in it for life. I'd found my true academic love, because it is an area of unequalled complexity. There are wonderful stories to be told, but as more understanding comes about, more questions arise, interesting questions. And so it started, and I suppose now for probably the last, goodness knows, 20 years, perhaps more, I've been working in the area of quality of life, but more specifically in trying to understand subjective well-being.
Can you tell us some of the milestones you feel that you achieved in your work that you're proud of?
There were two milestones, I suppose. The first came about through my work with intellectual disability, and at the time that I started on the quality of life, there were a number of scales to measure the quality of life of people with an intellectual disability. But what I realised was that all of these scales were specific to the condition. And what this meant was that they set the bar too low for a high quality of life. And so I wanted to create a scale that was normed to the general population, but which was also able to be used for people with an intellectual disability. And so I created this thing called the Comprehensive Quality of Life Scale, which is still available on the web with strong caveat statements attached to it, because we worked through about 5 or 6 editions of this thing, and my major goal was to try and create a scale that measured both separately measured objective and subjective quality of life for people with an intellectual disability. And I tried valiantly to get the objective side of the scale to factor properly. I never could achieve that, and I now realise why I couldn't achieve it, because objective items basically don't factor. But I didn't realise that at the time. But then I realised that wasn't working, the objective side, so I decided to discard that and create a new scale which just took the best bits of the old comprehensive scale and called this new one the Personal Wellbeing Index. And that has now been developing. This year it went into its 5th edition.
Wow.
And it's now quite a sophisticated, well-developed instrument. It's all up on the website, of course, with the fully worked up manual, norms and everything else. So that was a major thing for me. The second one was that I looked at the literature with some dismay, as I think so many of my colleagues have done, because there's a huge problem with nomenclature. Anything can be called anything. There is no standardisation in terms of measurement, so people report means and standard deviations, and goodness knows what they mean. And so I decided to see if I could determine some consistency in the numbers. And so I set about the business of collecting the mean scores of population data on subjective well-being, and I got data from, I don't know, maybe 15 countries and maybe 20 or 30 surveys. And I devised a simple little formula to turn any data from a scale into a standard 0 to 100 format. So I converted all of these data into 0 to 100, and to my absolute amazement, I found that the data were incredibly stable, that I could look at. I was only using data from North America, parts of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and of course all of those are fairly constant cultural kinds of places. And I found that all of the means that I'd located could be described as having a mean of 75 and a standard deviation of 2.5 points. In other words, all of those disparate surveys with data collected over many decades, all by different researchers using different instruments in different countries, nevertheless, all of their means could be collected to lie between 70 and 80 points. So this gave me the first indication that there was a level of consistency in subjective well-being that I could demonstrate, and which then required an explanation. Why? Why were all of these surveys giving such similar results? And that stimulated me then back into my thinking from physiology, where of course the idea of homeostasis has played such a huge role in terms of understanding how the body manages its business. And so I thought, well, maybe humans are managing their subjective well-being and trying to keep it constant. And so that then led me into developing a theory of subjective well-being homeostasis. And that has continued and grown. It's become elaborated now in a large number of papers. It's increasingly getting attention because because I use the word homeostasis, this makes very strong predictions about how subjective well-being data should behave, and those predictions seem to have been largely borne out. And the most recent addition to this story has been that homeostasis at its core has two requirements. The first is a set point that each person must have. Say body temperature is the perfect analogy. So we all have a set point for our body temperature, and then a very elaborate system to make sure that it stays very close to that set point. So what we've done over the years is to show some at least of the elaborate system which protects our subjective well-being and which returns it back to set point. But what we've most recently done, and this is a paper which has now been accepted and awaiting publication, it will be in the Journal of Happiness Studies, and what we've done is to use an extraordinary data set from Australia called the HILDA data set, and here they have 10 years of data on about 7,500 people.
Wow.
And each person has reported their subjective well-being each year. So we have 10 data points for each person. And so I've collaborated now with an amazing statistician from Melbourne University, Ning Lee, and the mastermind behind the project, which is Mark Wooden, and we have worked to test whether these data can be worked to demonstrate set points, and they can. And so we have now, I think, a pretty solid demonstration that set points exist as an individual difference. Each of us is genetically programmed to have our own set point. These set points lie in a normal distribution within the population between 70 and 90 points. And this is now a major building block, I suppose, of a fundamental building stone that the homeostasis theory required, and so that now seems to be in place, at least until somebody shows that it's all wrong.
Well, it's amazing. It's truly amazing. Any other milestones that you can tell us about that you feel that you're very particularly proud of? I mean, this is...
In terms of the subjective well-being work, there are collaborations are the ones that really stimulate so much additional thinking, and one of the understandings that I now have, which is obvious when it's explained, is that different cultural groups respond to our questions in different ways. This has been known generally for many decades, and the archetypal example of this is a comparison between people responding from Japan and responding from North America. And the Japanese responders always score lower on things like self-esteem, how much control they think they have, how good they are in almost anything. And of course the North Americans respond higher. And so this bias has been reported rather intermittently in the literature, but more recently we've taken this up in a more serious way, because all sorts of internationally comparative lists have been produced, primarily in more recent times by the Gallup organisation.
Yes.
And these are just pure fantasy. I mean, what they demonstrate is that a very highly educated, wealthy, civilized, clean, fantastic country like Japan reports very low levels of subjective well-being when compared with people from Nigeria or wherever. It's just ridiculous. And of course what culture does is to train people how to respond to their peers, to questions. That's what it does. And so culture teaches people how to respond to questions about themselves. And the Confucian culture that permeates obviously China, Japan, Singapore and so on, it teaches people to be modest. And even though they feel 10 out of 10, they don't say that. They say 7 or 8. They don't want to stand out. They don't want to be boastful. They're perhaps a little bit concerned that if they say 10, then something bad might happen to them. And for all of these reasons, they rate themselves lower. Now, this is a response bias. It's not that's not how they feel. And if you want to know how they feel, you've got to be a bit smarter at getting past this response bias. And you can do that. But it's the major reason that so many of the East Asian countries report lower levels of subjective well-being. So I think this is a major insight into how different cultures work, and particularly it indicates that we should not do these international comparisons of subjective well-being. We don't understand the cultural bias anywhere nearly strongly enough to be able to correct for these sort of interpretations. Subjective well-being are useful within countries to track change, but not for international comparisons.
Well, it's a very groundbreaking finding and fascinating interpretation of the data, because other people are saying that there's some kind of malaise in these Pacific Rim cultures when in fact you're saying they're just more self-effacing culturally. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mike. Absolutely, yes.
So, so these more doleful interpretations are just completely spurious.
Yes, they are, and I'm aware of those, and I'm sort of, it's interesting for me to observe that some very senior researchers in the area continue to put out these doleful interpretations of the data, even though, as far as I know, they have never addressed the critique that is offered by cultural response bias, and it's just a rather a pity that they can't recognise that.
Could this be a factor in higher scores in Latin American countries?
I think definitely. I think Latin America really stands out as being anomalous in these measures, and I think that again they're trained in a quite different way, culturally trained in a quite different way, and so understanding what it is in the culture that causes people to have these different ways of responding is quite fascinating in its own right. And so we probably need some good sociologists and anthropologists to join in with this fun and see if they can provide some explanations for us, and then we might start to understand what's going on.
Are there any, do you think there are some validated or cultural differences that you've seen in well-being over the years, either across countries or within countries? I know you've certainly looked at Australia and many.
Yes, Australia's a very boring country, of course. Nothing interesting ever happens in Australia, and so we've been tracking the Australian population now for 13 years using the Personal Wellbeing Index and our industry partners, Australian Unity, and we've run 2, 3 or 4 surveys every year across the Australian population, 2,000 people, new people every time. So we've got a very substantial database and understanding about the subjective well-being of the Australian population and how that relates to demographic characteristics and those kinds of things. And I think the most interesting use of subjective well-being is really to identify groups that are not doing well. Although the Australian average population is always on 75 plus or minus 1 point, when we dive in demographically and we look at different groups, we find that they are seriously below where they should be. And according to the homeostatic interpretation, and thinking again in terms of the analogy with body temperature, although we maintain our body temperature remarkably well, if we stand naked in a refrigerated room for very long, we start to become hypothermic because the challenge of the temperature loss exceeds the capacity of the body to generate heat and defend the set point of temperature. A perfectly analogous situation is with groups of people who are just suffering too much negative challenge in their lives so that they simply can't continue to defend their normal positivity. And I suppose the largest and most tragic group that we've discovered in this are people who are informal carers of a disabled family member at home. Even though they get substantial, well, I shouldn't say substantial, they get considerable financial support in Australia. There is a strong welfare safety net in Australia, but the challenges are more than financial that these informal carers have, and indeed the money is not really sufficient anyway. And so they come in with the lowest levels of subjective well-being of any group that we look at. They're at the level, approximately the same level as prisoners or street kids. all of whom we've also had a look at. And so this is wonderful for one of our other links is with an organisation called Carers Australia, which is the overarching body in Australia for informal carers. And so they use these data and these results very strongly for political purposes to show these results to politicians, arguing, of course, for increased funding. And one of the, I'm not suggesting there's a simple link here, but big changes in government policy come about through multiple little hits, and I think we've supplied one of those little components in that Australia has just in the last 6 months enacted a new legislation called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And what this does is to increase taxation by a small amount, some 1 or 2%, but the money goes into an insurance scheme, and the insurance is against giving birth to a disabled child. And so if people do give birth to a disabled child, they draw on this scheme and they get sufficient resources to be able to look after the disabled child and person, but also to have a decent life for themselves. So this is new and very interesting, I think, legislation in Australia.
And might these findings apply also to adult caregivers of, say, parents or other family members that may not have been disabled their entire life, but...
Absolutely so, absolutely so. And I believe there's discussion at the moment about how the disability insurance scheme can also support people who are, as you've just described, looking after their elderly parents at home and that kind of thing.
Well, it's a fascinating finding. It makes me think about revamping medical regimens completely to take into account the impact of illness and disability on caregivers.
Yes, there are such huge numbers of these people in Australia. We're talking about, 1 million people or something, maybe more, who are engaged in this process of looking after somebody. And so it's a huge issue. And of course, when people fail to maintain their normal levels of well-being, then they start to display the classical symptoms, DSM symptoms of depression, because the primary symptom is loss of positive well-being. And that's exactly what happens to them when they can no longer defend their set point, which is always positive, and gives them a positive sense of themselves. When the challenges become too strong, then their conscious level of affect, their subjective well-being, goes right down under the control of the challenging agent, and this then makes them enormously susceptible to depression. And as we know, depression is not only a dreadful disorder for the individual, but it really takes them out of society. It prevents them from doing the proper caring role. It stops them from holding down a job and all sorts of dreadful stuff. So it's all it's a dreadful condition, but what is happening now to try and address that, I think, is a great moment.
Yes, well, it sounds like a wonderful thing, and another one of your tremendous contributions. I'm aware of one study with patients awaiting lung transplants where well-being interventions for the patients themselves were actually somewhat contagious to their caregiving spouses and caregivers.
Yes.
And so that opens up in a whole other area of intervention and care for caregivers, which sounds like it's just incredible that you've documented this need.
Yeah, the contagious nature of low subjective well-being is a very interesting topic, and this also goes back to the carers, because who is the primary carer? Well, sometimes it's dad, but more often it's mum. And one of the studies that we did, this was a study of 4,000 carers across Australia, and we asked them, amongst the other questions, are you the primary caregiver? And you know, it didn't matter whether they were the primary or whether they were just a family member. They were just as depressed as the family, as the primary caregiver. And it makes sense. If you've got mum looking after a disabled family member and she's depressed, you're going to have a bad family environment, and that will take away one of your major supports for feeling positive about yourself and put you at great risk. So incredibly, it's not just the people who are the primary caregivers, it's all the people who are intimately associated with them in the family who are also at risk.
Wow.
So it's just the magnitude of the problem is extraordinary.
Well, are there any other milestones in your work that you want to highlight today that you can think of that you're proud of?
No, I think what I love now is getting students excited in this area, because the homeostasis story, I tell them we don't know whether this is right or not. It's a good story at this stage. We know that the data that we create fulfill the expectations of a homeostatic theory, but let me first of all indoctrinate you, I tell them, in the theory and how it works, and then your job is to show us why we are wrong. And we want to know this before anyone else.
Yes. Well, you're really indoctrinating them into science, and that's what we do. It's a wonderful thing. So that anticipates my next question, which was, how can we continue to keep this field vibrant and growing?
Well, I did a very naughty thing at the start of this year. Right at the start of this year, one of the distressing factors, which I've mentioned a little while ago, is that there is no agreed nomenclature. And this is I think it's the biggest handicap in the whole area. It actually stops people from understanding what other people are talking about.
Yes. So quality of life can be anything from pain to sexual problems to depression to
anything. It's just, as you say, it's perfectly extraordinary. And even if you take happiness, you've got some people who use it as a generally descriptive word of subjective well-being, and you've got other people like me who use it as a single affect on the circumplex. So there's no agreement. So I wanted to demonstrate this. So I sent a letter of invitation to 80 of the top researchers in the subjective wellbeing area, and my question to them was, what is your current favourite definition of subjective wellbeing?
Yes, I've seen those.
Each of these people.
You're trying to trap them, are you?
Yeah. Each of these people write extensively using subjective wellbeing, the term subjective wellbeing. And so it was no problem for them to just dash off their definition and send it back to me. I then looked at the results, and I knew what I'd found, and I knew that I couldn't use it. And so I then wrote back to them all and said, we have to here apply rules for the dissemination of this information. I said, I'm going to send you a document which identifies each of the person who's contributed, each of the people who've contributed and their definition, but you must agree with me that this is a document for your eyes only, and that you will allow no other person than yourself to see this document ever. And they all agreed to that, and then I distributed the document. and it's dead. It can't be used. But my purpose was to demonstrate to these people what I've just said.
Yeah.
We all have a different view, and some of those views are so different that people are using the term in ways that other people would not recognise.
Well,
How terrible is this? You know,
yeah.
I say in analogy that a group of physicists will stand around and happily talk about quarks,
Yeah.
and none of them have seen one, but they all have a perfectly common understanding about what the characteristics of a quark are.
Yes.
And we have not achieved that in psychology, and until we do, our discipline is just going to be shackled.
Well, it's another tremendous initiative, and in a very storied career, you've influenced so many researchers in profound ways, present company included. And I thank you for your tremendous contribution and for your time today.
Mike, thank you for a fantastic interview.
Okay.